To be a woman is complicated. To be a woman in our society is to unwillingly carry the burden of womanhood. Pretty, poised, dependent, unopinionated. Women are to be shapeshifters, to adapt to a system that has repeatedly told them they are responsible for the misbehaviors of men. That will tell you you're beautiful one day and the next no longer. You are too big and then too thin, too outgoing, too quiet, too responsible, too risky. Too much of a woman. I am tired of being silenced. I am tired of being censored, and I am tired of my existence being created and controlled by men. While I know that my existence is more than a body, this body is not separate from me. I owe her the representation she deserves, and that is not one of seduction, but one of ownership, one of power and strength, resilience and freedom. So here we are. We refuse to be silenced, and we refuse to be censored. Hello, my name is Destiny Roberts. I have a major in art with a minor in gender, women, and sexualities, and today I will be presenting my thesis work titled The Riot Series. This is a series of 3 portraits critiquing the existence of sexual objectification in relation to the male gaze, and our culture's inability to reform a system that actively dehumanizes women for their bodies. I would also like to give a warning before I begin. There is mention of sexual harassment and assault in this presentation. The Riot series was inspired by 90s Riot Girl feminism, a movement that influenced me to continue my education in the Gender, Women, and Sexualities program after taking Intro to Women's Studies my sophomore year of college. I learned of the Riot Girl movement in that course, and I fell in love with how freely these women expressed themselves and the sense of community they radiated. Zines were a creative outlet in the punk rock scene, and I pulled influence from these DIY projects in the Riot series. The artistic side of this movement is what I'm trying to return to. I believe I envy the sense of community this movement created, and it is my goal as a feminist and as an artist to give that same feeling to young girls who could be impacted by it in the way I've been impacted by this movement. In 1977, Tommy Ann Roberts and Barbara Fredrickson presented objectification theory, a theory which illuminates the experience of women in cultures that sexually objectify them, and in return, how that leads to women internalizing that as their primary view of self. This internalization can result in mental and physical illness in both women and men. As society is teaching women how to be objectified, it is also simultaneously teaching men how to objectify. Women are more likely to suffer from eating disorders and mental illness due to sexual objectification, while men are more likely to hold anti-equality ideals. Sexual objectification, in the simplest of terms, is the act of treating a person as an object of sexual desire, rather than a human being. I think it is important to note that sexual objectification is a form of oppression on its own, but it also is a facilitator for so many other forms of abuse and oppression. Sexual harassment, assault, dehumanization, domestic violence, anti-equality movements, and so much more. The male gaze in feminist theory refers to the act of depicting women in the world through a masculine, heterosexual perspective. Within that, women are represented as objects of sexual desire that exist for the pleasure of the male viewer. The development of a male gaze theory by Laura Mulvey used Sigmund Freud's analysis of gaze theory, which states that humans assess each other as sexual objects, and in doing so, exert power over the viewed person. This speaks to why as a society we have placed women primarily on the side of being viewed. Mulvey also states that all theories rest on the idea of desire, and how desire is linked to the active process, which is male, and the passive process, which is female. I understand this to be the male process is the active process of looking or desiring, while the female process is passive in the act of being looked at or desired upon. The male gaze is a manifestation of patriarchal sexual order and gender inequality. My minor thesis was focused on the link between Western beauty standards and sexual objectification in rape culture, and when I started translating that research into my artwork, I found myself creating feminist-focused art. At this point in my studies as a student and my career as an artist, I would consider myself a feminist artist. Feminist art made an appearance in the 60s and 70s with artists like Yoko Ono, Cindy Sherman, Judy Chicago, and so many more. As part of my minor, I was required to take a feminist theory class where I unintentionally, but gratefully, fell in love with feminist theorists and writings. Authors like Bell Hooks have influenced my art and the way this project came to be just as heavily as any artistic influence. Learning about feminist theory and all the intersections of oppression and identity that feminism can address is what I fell in love with. And reading educated women talk about powerful topics that women are engaging with really sparked an activist nature in me. Speaking of artistic and aesthetic influences, I'd like to discuss the artists I turned to for this project, as well as the aesthetic choices I've made. Feminist street artist Miss Me, an anonymous street artist from Montreal, has been using wheat paste and prints to talk about the scrutiny of female bodies for several years. Her work is the result of her own life experiences after what she said was her breaking point with sexual harassment and assault. I drew heavily upon the DIY aspect of the punk rock feminist movement. Zines were a big way of communicating events, meetups, and messages between people in the community in the 90s. Before social media, before the ability to organize entire events online, these zines were the main way of connecting with the feminist community. I wanted to somehow correlate the zine aesthetic into this work. When I began piecing this project together, I had a completely different direction I wanted it to take, and I believe that was because it was what felt safe to me as an artist. However, as my ideas developed and the more I talked about these systems and institutions that I wanted to critique, I became aware that I needed my work to critique those institutions itself without the help of my voice. I took a socially engaged art course last semester where I had created previous projects that took to the public or were guerrilla style set up in public spaces. Angela Davis Johnson, an artist whose work focuses on the evolving identity of African Americans, once said, "To engage space as an artist is to challenge perceptions by interrupting and disrupting social environments with your voice and body." That statement describes the trajectory of this project flawlessly, and with that, I decided to take my series of artwork to public spaces, rather than a gallery. Before I get into the installation of my work, let me give you a visual analysis of each, as they are heavy in metaphor and research. This first portrait, untitled Number 1, embodies modern feminism and its connection to social media. While social media is more often than not a facilitator for sexual objectification, the link between social media and activism has been growing and become much more important in recent times of COVID. We see the subject through the lens of her phone. Assuming she's posting this somewhere on social media creates the narrative of activism we've seen occur throughout the past year. We've seen massive social media movements regarding Black Lives Matter, Turkish femicides, Asian American violence, and so much more. Simultaneously, this portrait is critiquing the aspects of social media that work against feminism. The censoring of female bodies in any public context that is of their own choosing. This is represented in the graffiti and text that has been added on top of the portrait that reads, "Stop censoring female bodies," with an X covering one of her breasts. Untitled Number 2 is posed in a way that resonates with the reclining female nude. The reclining nude is, and historically has been, removed from reality and presented in a way that the viewer is suggested to gaze upon her freely, as an object of viewing. You can look at famous Renaissance paintings of Venus, multiple of which are posed with Venus in the reclining nude, not making eye contact with the viewer and existing as an object rather than a human being. Here you see examples of Titian's Venus of Urbino and his Sleeping Venus. In this portrait, her return of the gaze and confidence in her demeanor are what stands apart. She is demanding your attention through her pose and then critiquing you for partaking in her viewing. This portrait is having a conversation with the viewer in a way that is different from the others. It is confronting the viewer both in text and imagery and catching people in the act. This critique is a modern take on the same ideas of Manet's Olympia, which you see here. This work was progressive for its time. The subject is asserting dominance over her body, covering herself with one hand, and looking intentionally at the viewer. Lastly, Untitled Number 3 is one of reflection and perception. The use of the mirror in contemporary art has been as a way of self-reflection, looking inward and the gaze. As the viewer, we are seeing the subject using the mirror as a way of self-reflection, creating a dual perception of what we see in the frame versus what we see in the mirror. American feminist Catherine McKinnon once said, "All women live in sexual objectification the way fish live in water." A quote that has never left my train of thought since I heard it. We live in a society where sexual objectification can feel inescapable, and you see that being depicted with the abundance of eyes. They've appeared throughout each portrait, but are heavily involved in this one. These eyes are visual representations of the male gaze, meant to hold the weight of the feeling of being looked at. The reflection given back in the mirror has no imagery of these eyes, with intention to represent her idealized reflection. You can see the same mirror phase being used in Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, where the mirror phase is used to look past the visible world and examine one that cannot comprehend on a conscious level. Similarly, sexual objectification has become so weaved into our daily lives it can be hard to identify. Street art, and specifically street art that deals with activism, allows artists to reach a broader audience than traditional art forms. Putting this work together in a gallery would remove the confrontational aspect that it was made to include. It allows people who, 1, have access to a gallery, and 2, would willingly be looking for art to interpret, to be the only ones viewing and interpreting the work. I knew I wanted the Riot series to exist in a context outside of a gallery space. This project was made with intention to share its message with the public and start conversation that could enact social change. And with that, bringing this work to the streets was what gave it life. I homemade my wheat paste by mixing white flour and water together and boiling it until it reached a glue-like consistency. The DIY aspect of this form of installation corresponded well with my project and the areas in which I was drawing inspiration. Part of activist art, and the specific movement I've drawn upon for this project, is the aspect of doing what you can with what you have. Using any means you can to get your message out there, and that is how I looked at the creation and installation of this work. I printed 6 drawings, 32 by 38, and posted them in strategic locations as well as random ones that just spoke to me. And then it was time to install. This is Untitled number 3, posted in a Denver alley. I searched for an area that felt comfortable enough to whip out my supplies and post this fairly large depiction of a woman battling sexual objectification, but an area that still had enough foot traffic it wouldn't go unnoticed. This was the first wheat paste I had ever done, and I would say I was a little nervous. We ended up in an alley between a wall of businesses and a parking lot, where I knew it would get interaction from those parking as well as those walking through the alley to get to their shops. This is Untitled number 1 on the side of Colfax. I posted this in an area I've stumbled across other activist street art that I've engaged with, and we angled it towards the streets. That way those walking and driving, or even stopped waiting to turn, would come in direct contact with this one. I had a lot of community engagement just in the process of installing this work because the area is such high traffic. It was exactly what I intended to happen. Lastly, this is Untitled number 2, posted behind Skyline Pub in Edgewater. Located directly across from Sloan's Lake, this bar has been one to really excel in the gentrification happening in this area and is a constant spot for young individuals who might be impacted by the message. I installed this work in the alley right behind the bar that is also used as a thoroughfare to the parking lot of the bar, a dispensary, and 2 or 3 other restaurants. Location was important for each of these works. I wanted different spaces that all different walks of people would travel through. There is a piece of my heart that I've fully given to this project and decided to share with the world. My relationship to this work is stronger than anyone will ever know. But it's the first time I've embodied myself in a work and bought into my abilities as an artist and activist. I've been creating art forever and studying sexual objectification as a form of healing for a few years now, but this project was the first time I felt I belonged. The Riot series was cathartic to create, and as much as it was healing for me, I hope it can do the same through being viewed. I also have to say this project wouldn't have been able to come to life without the amazing women who shared their bodies and stories with us all. My ability to create this project wouldn't have been possible without the peers and professors I've met in my last 5 years at Metro. My growth, both as an individual and as an artist, has been heavily influenced, if not fully influenced, by those who have pushed me to see a world I have potential to change.